Friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to John, chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Well, an inventor that you probably never heard of was a man named Stephen Sesson. He was a person who in the 1970s, in 1975, he invented the digital camera. All right? Now, this was not the kind of camera that you now have in your pocket, although the technology is similar. This very first iteration of the digital camera weighed 8 pounds. Its resolution was a whopping 100 by 100 pixels. And it recorded the image onto a cassette tape, and it took 23 seconds to record the image onto the cassette tape. But it worked, and it proved that you could use what were called CCDs, the charge-coupled devices. It proved that you could use a CCD to record an image. Now here's the problem. He worked for Eastman Kodak. And Kodak filed for patents on the invention and then buried it. They buried the invention because they were convinced that this digital camera technology would hurt their film business. So they suppressed the invention. In the meantime, other companies developed alternative ways of having a digital camera, and then in 2012, Kodak files for bankruptcy. Because when the opportunity was in front of them to venture into something new and risky and beneficial, they chose instead not to. They chose not to take advantage of the opportunity that was there. Well, this is a story of an opportunity. The story that we have today is the story of an opportunity, and it happens to be a story that is told in all 4 Gospels. However, the story changes considerably from gospel to gospel, except for Matthew and Mark. Their telling is very similar. So we're going to look at how this story is different from gospel to gospel. You can see in the first column when it appears. In square brackets is the number of chapters in that book, so you can get an idea. So in Matthew, it's chapter 26 out of 28. It's toward the end. In Mark, it's chapter 14 out of 16. It's toward the end. In Luke, it's chapter 7 out of 24. It's toward the beginning. And in John, which is where we are today, it is chapter 12 out of 21. It's pretty much right in the middle of the story. Which house is it? In Matthew and Mark, the house is that of Simon the leper, a leper who had been cured by Jesus. In Luke's telling, it's the home of a Pharisee who invites Jesus to dinner. And in John's telling, it is the home of Lazarus, whose sisters, of course, are Mary and Martha, and whom Jesus raised from the dead. Who's the person who does the anointing? In Matthew and Mark, it is simply an unnamed woman. In Luke's telling, it's a sinful woman. All right, the Pharisee says, "Don't you know who this woman is? Why are you letting her touch you?" And in John's gospel, it is Mary, the sister of Lazarus. By the way, none of them are Mary Magdalene. Okay, so sometimes that gets promulgated out there. That's just false. Okay, none of them are Mary Magdalene. In each of the stories, there is an objection, and the objector to the act is in Matthew's gospel, it's the disciples who raise an objection. In Mark's gospel, it's just some who are present raise the objection. In Luke's gospel, it's the Pharisee, the host of the dinner, who raises the objection. And in John's gospel, it is Judas who raises the objection. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because each of these stories has to be read in its context in terms of the gospel narrative, all right? Each of the stories has been tailored in each gospel in order to fit the narrative of that gospel. I mean, we are convinced that this is one story told in different settings unless Jesus had some particular propensity to attract women who wanted to dump expensive perfume on him multiple times. We think that's less likely as an outcome, so we just presume that this story is the same story, and the person telling the gospel narrative has taken that story and made it fit the story well. That's why we are going to be looking at this story strictly through the lens of the Gospel of John. All right? It's why you take these stories, even when a story appears in multiple Gospels, you have to really take it in the gospel in which it's told. You have to really look at the story from that perspective, because that's the narrative that's providing the context for that story. It's not the other gospels, all right? And so we are in John chapter 12, and we're going to take a look at some things that happen in John chapter 11 and in John chapter 13. Because it's really this narrative flow through chapters 11, 12, and 13 that provide a backdrop for understanding what the author of the gospel is getting across in this story. Now, of course, it begins at the home of Lazarus, which is in Bethany. Bethany is about 2 miles from Jerusalem, and it's in the central province of Judea. It's not in Galilee, which is where Jesus is from, okay? So this is not his home turf. And what happened was that in chapter 11, word comes to Jesus that Lazarus is dying, all right? And Jesus says, let's go, all right? So they're back in Galilee, and Jesus says, let's go back to Bethany. The problem is that the disciples don't think it's safe to go to Bethany. So in chapter 11, so we're now in John chapter 11, verse 8, the disciples say to Jesus, Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again? The disciples think he's reckless for wanting to go back to Bethany because of the fact that the last time they were there were people who wanted to stone him. Now, in verse 16 of chapter 11, Thomas, and this is doubting Thomas. All right, so this is doubting Thomas. And one of the things that I mention every year, because the story of doubting Thomas, for whatever reason, the composers of the lectionary made the story of doubting Thomas the gospel lesson for the Sunday after Easter every single year, which is something that I have always personally lamented, because the Sunday after Easter is where you have your most regular attendees, okay? I mean, right? I mean, you know, if people are coming twice a year, it's not like the Sunday after Easter, okay? All right, that's not one of them. So it's your most regular people, and they're subjected to the same gospel lesson, not once every 3 years, but every single year, okay? Maybe I'll try and switch it up this year because we have the freedom to do that. But every year when I talk about the Thomas lesson, one of the things that I remind you is that Thomas is not present when Jesus appears to the disciples, because it says that the disciples were in a locked room for fear of the people. All right? The people, they were fearful that they would be crucified like Jesus. So they're in a locked room. And the reason why Thomas isn't there is because Thomas doesn't feel like hiding out in fear. Thomas is courageous. He's also a pessimist. All right? So he's got that wonderful dual quality of being the pessimistic, brave person. All right? Brave enough to die, pessimistic enough to believe he will. All right? And so he says, let's go that we may die with him. All right? So that's That's the personality of Thomas wrapped up in one. He's not going to cower in fear, nor does he believe it's going to work out well. Let's go. But this is a really important setup for what happens in the next chapter with the anointing. Because it's a reminder that Jesus and the disciples, Jesus didn't just heal Lazarus. They risked themselves in order to heal Lazarus. The disciples were telling Jesus, no, we shouldn't go back there. They're trying to kill you and us. So there's this huge potential sacrifice that Jesus had made in order to be able to heal Lazarus. Right? He had taken a big risk. The disciples thought that he was putting his life at risk by going to Bethany to heal Lazarus. So naturally, that's an incredible thing that he did. It's not just the healing, it's the risk he took in order to perform the healing. And then when they're at this house, they gave a dinner for him. And by the way, what happened between chapter 11 and 12 is that Jesus went away, and then he comes back to Bethany on his way to Jerusalem. All right, so that's what's happened. He went back to Galilee after healing Lazarus, then he comes back to Bethany. Now, there's a funny reference here because it says Martha served. Because this is the Martha of the Mary and Martha story, but it's from the Gospel of Luke. But in the Gospel of Luke, remember the story of Mary and Martha, and you have Mary who just wants to sit at the feet of Jesus, and Martha is busy because Martha has been making all of the preparations for the dinner, and Martha complains to Jesus because her sister Mary hadn't been helping her. Well, clearly the character of Mary and Martha is consistent across the Gospels, because here in this story, Martha is serving yet again, and Mary is the one who's going to dump a whole jar of expensive perfume on Jesus. So the character remains consistent. But it says Martha served, and Lazarus, raised from the dead, is there with them. And so now Mary comes in and takes this pound of costly perfume. And Mary's action begins to make more sense when you remember that Jesus had healed her brother at the risk of their lives. It wasn't just what he did, but he put themselves at personal risk in order to do this. And this is the only telling of the story that makes reference to the smell of the perfume. All the other stories talk about how expensive it is. But this is the only story that makes a point of talking about how the perfume filled the house with the fragrance of the perfume. And this detail of the smell actually sits in counterpoint to the story of the raising of Lazarus. Because in the story of the raising of Lazarus, Jesus gets there after Lazarus has already died. And he's been dead for a few days. And Jesus says, take away the stone from the front of the tomb where they had laid Lazarus. And Martha says, don't, it stinks. Already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days. And so the smell of the dead Lazarus was an important part of the story of the raising of him, and it sits in counterpoint to the smell of the perfume that Mary anoints Jesus with in gratitude for what he had done. And this contrast between the stench of Lazarus' corpse and the smell of the perfume is an important symbolism for us to remember that generosity, that act of generosity of Mary's, transforms the world. It transforms the smell of the world. We often talk about smell as setting the ambiance of a situation, right? We sit there and say something smells suspicious or something like that. We talk about smell to describe a circumstance. And her generosity is changing the smell of the world. It changes the smell of the world from the stench of death to the smell of sweet perfume. Generosity transforms the way the world smells to the people who are in it. Now, every telling of the story had an objector. And in this case, the objector is specifically named as Judas. By the way, spoiler alert, Judas turns out to be the bad guy. So, in case you weren't sure where this story ends up moving as we get closer to Easter, Judas is the bad guy. Hope that didn't spoil it for any of you. And he says, why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii? And 300 denarii, remember, a denarius is about a day's pay for a worker. So 300 denarii is close to a year's salary for a worker, especially since in a Jewish community they wouldn't work on the Sabbath. So it's basically a year's pay. Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor? Well, the problem with this argument is that it makes sense. Right? This argument makes sense. Why wasn't it sold and the money given to the poor? And so what they have to do is they have to explain the argument. They have to explain the argument that Judas is making because they have to explain the fact that he's doing what a lot of us do, which is hiding behind the argument that we think will work, as opposed to stating our actual objection. I mean, this is very tempting for us to do. A situation arises, and we don't want to do it. I mean, so often this happens in life, and this happens in churches. You have people who make a reasonable objection to an idea, but when you get under it, what you understand is that's not actually their problem. Their problem is just they don't like the idea. They just don't like it, and so they want to win, and so they invent a reasonable argument against it, but really, when you dig underneath it, what's actually there is, well, I just don't like it. I just don't like it. All right. It would be like we had a very mild debate over what color chairs we were going to put in here. Okay? And you can like blue. One of the other options was red. Was a deep red, and actually the architect had recommended brown for the chairs. But we settled on blue, and I'm very happy with the blue. But it would almost be like someone saying, "Well, I don't think you should choose blue," and having them come up with some argument from color theory about the mood that blue would set, or something like that. When really, what it boils down to is they just don't like blue. But we do that all the time, okay? We disguise our actual objection by making a false argument of supposed substance instead of simply saying, I just don't like it. So they explain that Judas was doing this, that Judas was making an objection that wasn't what he was really objecting about. They say that he was a thief. Now, mind you, there's actually no evidence of this beyond this story. Nowhere else in the gospel accounts do they accuse Judas of being a thief. And it says he kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it, except there's also no record in the Gospels of Jesus and his disciples ever asking people for money. Right? It seemed more like they would go from town to town and live off the generosity of people who were there, inviting him and his followers to come for dinner, and sharing food with him. But it never seemed like he asked for money. Right? There's no record of him collecting money and using it to buy food for his disciples. In fact, one of the things about traveling with Jesus is that, remember the times when they don't have money for food? He somehow is able to just make food happen. Okay? So, when you're traveling with Jesus, you don't really need to worry about whether you have room on your credit card, because you got Jesus with you, and he can sort of make food as you need it. But let's accept this argument at face value. Let's presume that Judas had an agenda. And we need to remind ourselves that sometimes we have an agenda. And we have to be honest with ourselves about our own self-interests. We have to be honest with ourselves about our own egos. All right? So sometimes when a situation arises and it triggers something within you emotionally, we have to be honest about whether that is our ego talking, whether it's our self-interest talking, because only when we're honest about our own motivations, when we're willing to look inside ourselves and realize what it is that we are actually objecting to, can we determine whether that objection is valid and then process it the way we may need to. Because when we're not honest, all right, we start saying things that aren't accurate, and it just leads to all kinds of ramifications. Like so many of us who use the word later when what we really mean is never. All right. Let's take that up in the future. Timing's not right now. But when we start doing this, then what we're doing is we're not actually giving an authentic no, and an authentic no is the flip side of an authentic yes. And we kind of just need to be more authentic in the way we move through the world in giving authentic no's to situations and giving authentic yes to situations. Because there's a role for each of those in our lives. And so Mary, faced with this opportunity to show love and devotion to Jesus, does so, and despite the objection of Judas, she does it, and Jesus says to Judas, look, leave her alone. Because there's a significance to what she's doing. And the significance of what she's doing and the significance of what Jesus is allowing her to do in that moment actually becomes clearer when you jump ahead to what happens in the next chapter, in chapter 13. There's a continuing thread here. Because what happens here is that she has taken this expensive perfume and she has anointed Jesus' feet with it. And Jesus says, allow her to do this for me. And in chapter 13, that's the chapter where Jesus washes the feet of the disciples. And Simon, Peter, doesn't want this. Peter objects to being served. And he says, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? All right. Whereas Jesus had just allowed himself to be served. See, Jesus had just allowed Mary to anoint his feet, to wipe his feet. He had allowed this, and now it is time for Jesus to do this for Peter. And he tells Peter, look, unless I wash you, you have no share with me. You need to allow this service to be done for you. Just as Jesus had allowed that service to be done for him immediately before. It's a reminder that there's a time to serve and a time to be served. And we need to be ready for each. We need to be ready to allow ourselves to be served when the situation calls for it, as well as be ready to serve when the situation calls for it. A lot of times people are more comfortable with one than the other. All right? I mean, a person who only wants to be served and never wants to serve, well, we try not to have those people around, right? But there's also a lot of folks who only want to serve and never want to allow others to serve them. And that also presents a problem. Because in an authentic relationship, right, there is both. In an authentic relationship, there is a time to serve and a time to be served. And we both serve and allow ourselves to be served as the situation calls for it. In an authentic relationship, we're honest about our motivations, we're honest about what we're thinking, and we're honest about how we answer. So Jesus says, look, she's been ready for this. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. She was preparing for his death But you'll notice he's not dead. All right? She bought it for his death. But that had not quite come yet. However, she was ready for the moment. She was ready for the opportunity. She didn't have it fixed in her mind, that, hey, I'm saving this ointment for when he dies, and I'm only going to use it when he dies. Instead, she adapts to the situation. She sees the moment. She sees the opportunity of him being there, and then she acts. She had said no in many ways in order to be ready to say yes. She had saved her money, right? This is a year's salary. So she had saved her money in order to be able to buy the perfume. We don't know when she bought the perfume. She could have been carrying this around with her for weeks or months or whatever. We don't know when she bought it. But she was ready for the moment. She was ready for the moment, which we have to be, because we don't know when the opportunity to say yes, when the opportunity to serve is going to be in front of us. And those opportunities can be fleeting. And if we're not in a position to take advantage of it, if we're not in a position to serve when we're needed, then the moment passes. I remember seeing a guy in a parking lot one time, and a person needed a jump. And the person made the statement to the person, "I have jumper cables at home." Because he wanted to indicate his willingness to help. But those jumper cables sure would have come in handy, like, in his car. Okay? We need to have the jumper cables. And we need to have them with us for the moment when the car needs us. Because that moment can come at any time. And what Jesus says is something that's often misquoted when he says you always have the poor with you. He's not endorsing the continuing existence of poverty. He is simply saying that the opportunity to serve the impoverished is fairly consistent. There will be impoverished people around. However, the opportunity to serve him in this moment was not going to be around forever. You might only have a moment to decide. You might only have that point in time in which to be able to respond to an opportunity to make the world a better place. Later might be never in such a situation because the time is right then. And so these opportunities can arise suddenly. And when they arise, we can always find reasons to say no. But we need to be looking for the opportunity to say yes. We need to be ready. We need to do what it takes to be ready. And in her case, that was a series of no's, right? She didn't spend her money. She saved her money. She said no in order to be ready to say yes. And that's one of the most valuable uses of saying no, is to make room in your life to say yes. Because if you say yes to everything, you will have absolutely no margin in your life with which to say yes to something that arises. So we need to say no in order to be ready to say yes. And then when that time comes, be ready to seize the moment and say yes to the chance to make the world smell more fragrant through an act of generosity, an act of service that you can provide to others. Amen.